in our profession at that level as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you.
Okay, James.
Thank you very much. So just before we go, I would like just to take the moment to offer a couple of reflections. I think Henrietta is going to follow me as well. So if I may just look back, first of all, on the first Women Macroeconomics conference that we held, which Carolina mentioned at the outset. That was really about cultures of expertise, and we had some concerns about representation. But what was different about today was trying to say, actually, it's not just about the number of people sitting on a panel that fit a certain gender. That's not it. There's actually, that's important, but there's something deeper in the subject. And I think Julie's presentation, when she put the list of differences and said, this is feminine, this is masculine, perhaps goes at why there is such low participation by women particularly in macroeconomics. There was a study done recently about what economists thought, and they surveyed 1,500 economists, and there's an interesting split in the gender side of how men and women see economics and what they prefer them to do more. Women were much more in favor of interdisciplinarity, much more asking policy relevant and less purely abstract questions. So it seems to be that it's not just a question of who sits on the panels. There's more to this question than that. But I started off today by talking about, slightly provocatively, saying that economics is a social science of choice. Now, I think the reason why that's provocative, because people default into their views of what choice means, and they go back to Friedman's price theory book or something like that. I think that's choice. Actually, that's only part of it, because you have a decision maker and you have the environment. And Charu, I thought, brought out very richly how those two things are connected. They're not independent of each other. Is the environment well defined for making choices? Yeah. In modern economics, we think it is. We write it down that it is well defined. But since my choices depend on Alan's choices, which depend on Henrietta's choices, which depend on Carolina's choices, it becomes an infinite regress very, very quickly. And it's not obvious it is well defined at all. So we have this environment that is one that reflects our behavior. And that's where we're going to start off from in our approach to macroeconomics. So I'm writing this roadmap. We've called this social macroeconomics. It's a little bit, for want of better words, we've got social. It does have other connotations. But the idea is that the environment isn't necessarily well defined. But we discovered a long time ago with our ancestors that our chance of procreation and survival are much better if we do some things together beyond kin. And in doing that, what's quite weird about us is we have worked out a way of setting objectives for ourselves, unlike other animals. And these things, these conditions for our behavior, are things like ethics and morals, which have kind of gone missing from economics. And so that's kind of the environment. Now, within that, then we have the individuals who have a degree of agency. To me, choice means agency. You have the right to choose, to at least make a decision. Not everything is determined. So you have a degree of agency that may be heavily constrained, particularly the way Charu was talking about, with violence and so on. Nobody at all is trying to say this is equal, but we have a sense of agency. Now, how do we choose in an environment where we have morals and ethics and it's not well defined? Well, here we get to really what human beings are, and that was the point of today, because choice isn't the outcome of a set of assumptions which gives you a mathematical property where you have chosen and that is an optimum, even though you didn't go through the cognitive process of choosing. You see, the mathematics gets rid of the cognitive process. And what we want to have is a cognitive process where we have to go through trial and error, sometimes guesswork, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes we do behave by copying each other because we don't know whether it's going to work, and we get ourselves into trouble and we get these undesirable outcomes. But it's this shift by saying that you have individuals who are more than a set of axioms working in environments that are not well defined in a mathematical sense. It gets us to, now you've separated this mapping from assumptions to equilibria, we've separated them. And in the middle of those two things that we've separated, we actually allow the cognitive process of choice. And in that, we have institutions, we have hierarchies, we have all the different inputs and intermediate levels of society and economies have, which get covered over just by thinking about these assumptions and the final equilibrium position. So that's where we're trying to go to with social macroeconomics, as it's currently called. And that's why today was very helpful and important for us to hear from such great speakers, all of their ideas. So Henrietta, at that note, I'm going to pass over to you, but I'm delighted to take one or two questions at the end of it.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, for a very stimulating afternoon and great presentations and questions and lots of provocation, which is always fun. In fact, the best bit really of doing these kinds of things. I just wanted to say a few things about what we've been talking about. I'm not going to talk in my remarks about the inequalities of economics as a professional, what happens in economics departments, although that is extremely important. And I mentioned it in something I said earlier in the day. But I think that one of the difficulties here is, why does the notion of the economic agent arise in the way that it does? And of course, economics suffers from the problem that, in fact, Marx's theory suffered from, which is that Marx's theory of labor value had nothing to do with the idea that he had invented it. What he did is he started with the problem of people living a horrible life in factories, and then reduced backwards reductively to something that might explain it. So here we have the same problem, is that we start with ideas which are about actually sort of the system, productivity, efficiency, equilibrium, maximization. And by taking those into account, we arrive at this rather sort of unpalatable notion of the economic agent. And of course, this agent is not actually an agent in any real sense that we understand it in any other part of the social sciences. And the economic agent is not a role. It's not a group. It's not an agent as we understand it in any other part of the social sciences. It is, of course, normative construct and therefore very useful, but it's also very sort of orthogonal to the world as we understand it. And so therefore working from a discipline which assumes that macroeconomics is the outcome of utility maximization or the preferences of individuals is going to be very tricky in this case. Because the thing that has been created at the root problem is going to generate a whole lot of things which probably don't explain the world as the way it is. So that's the first thing I would say, is that how is thinking about, if we want to change that economic agent, or if you would wish to change it, then the question is, what does this new economic approach you're all striving for, what is it exactly? How does it work? Why would it be of value? And what exactly does it look like? So here we come then to the conversations we've been having, and really brilliant presentations by everybody on this question of identities are plural. Of course they are. But the question of how individual identities relates to social identities is one of these things which is like dynamic system. You're never going to understand the answer to it. There is no single answer to this question. This is a question that is about something that is evolving in time and place. And there are, of course, consistencies, and there are certainly non-consistencies in the way we have chosen to talk about it or to represent it or to put it into literature or other things. But those are really our political and emotional choices. They're not necessarily accounts of what's actually taking place. So when we talk about plural identities, I think we have to think much more not about identities, but about identifications. So that is the things we identify with as individuals. So why do we as individuals, for example, take up membership of social groups? Now, sometimes, of course, people just say, well, they're born into them. But actually, many of our great passions are to do with things that we're not born into. You know, you're not necessarily born into membership of a fan club of the Beatles, right? This is something you decide for yourself. And there are plenty, you're not born into the Republican Party either, except in very general sense. And we take up a fantasy relation with those kinds of larger entities because we find points of identification or congruence that make sense to us as we go through life. So identification is more useful in this sense than a notion of a fixed identity, even the notion of a plural identity. And I think this takes up the point that John was making about relationality. Why does relationality matter? Well, relationality matters because context matters. It really does matter the kind of society you're born into. Are you born into a democracy, or are you born into an authoritarian regime? But what happens to you after that really is about the way you negotiate the relationship between the experiences you have on a day-to-day sense and the larger discourse or discussion that's going on in society. So thinking about how young people learn very early on to identify with something called the gay movement, even if they're living in a very, very repressive part of a country, they're identifying imaginatively and emotionally with something outside them, but they've never probably directly experienced until a certain moment themselves. So there are many, many ways of us forming those processes of identification. The difficulty is that economic systems are set up to shape that process of identity formation, as are political systems, because governments, politics is often about shaping both the social categories we live through, i.e. what is it to be a man, and rearranging the points of identification that you can have with them, the ones that make most sense in your context. So what kind of a man are you in the time in which you were born, or woman, or anybody else for that matter, but we're talking about gender just for a second. And so the fact that politics, including economic policy, so think how important economic policy was in the years after the Second World War, with its extreme focus and its congruence between welfare policy, the policy of the current government at the time in the United Kingdom, and the social movements that underpin trade unionism after the Second World War. They created, at that moment, something called a family man, who had to have a family wage. And that person who had to have a family wage had to be able to provide for the family. That notion of provider then became the dominant notion of masculinity for large numbers of people. And it was shaped in a particular way by an economic system that required certain kinds of productivity gains and certain kinds of processes of rapid expansion of industrialization. Through that process after the Second World War, needing to get men back into work and women out of the workplace, etc. And these were all policy decisions, but they were also discussions about how you would shape that society. So when we understand a social role, we have to understand it as being deeply involved in those processes of the politics of economics, if you like. So this is really going back to the old-fashioned political economy would help quite a lot here, because of course it takes you into that field of distributions of power and so on. So I can't go on much longer than this because Angus is going to shut me up for a second. Got 1 minute to go. But I do think that identification is something very useful here. And I also thinking about what is it that's going to replace the agent. So what is the new characterization of the agent? And we had some good thoughts today from lots of people there, from Julie in particular, but also from many others, talking about solidarity or care or resilience or whatever. And I think those things are important and powerful for economics going forward.
Thank you very much indeed, Henrietta. Very thoughtful end to the day. Is there anything burning that anybody finally wants to say before we say au revoir? No, in which case, can I thank you all very much indeed for all of your inputs and efforts today. It's been very stimulating and we're extremely grateful for your time. So on behalf of Carolina and I, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And we'll see you.
It's been a lot of fun. It's been a lot of fun.
Yes, it has. Oh, and Merry Christmas when it arrives. Thank you very much.
And thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.